Hello, YouTube Paul family.
It's not there yet. I will let you know.
Right.
I guess there's no harm in letting your friends in.
Hello, good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, X-Man. Hey, Bill. Hi, Xavier. Hi, babe. You're always on time for the board meetings. You're such a good trustee. Yeah, you are. Hello, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello, hello.
How you
Hello.
doing? Sterling, I can't see your face. I haven't seen you in ages.
Might be on mute.
He is.
Yeah.
Hey, Aaron. Hey, Miss Beatty. And Gina. Gina, I read your text yesterday. I got so happy, and then I read it again today and got unhappy. Now they were saying we could get a complete waiver. I was like,
Yeah,
oh,
it's a mixed bag.
I know. It was a mixed bag. We probably won't take advantage of any of it. So
Yeah, that's the
there's
other
that.
issue.
Yeah. All right. How you doing, Jeff?
Very good, thanks. How are you?
Good. Good.
Yeah.
Sleepy. I'm tired today.
Yeah.
But Xavier's not tired. He's so big, Christina.
He's never tired. He's up at like 10:30. Say goodbye. Say goodbye, everybody.
Bye,
Time
babe.
is up.
I'm so glad you're always in attendance.
He said, I would like to know how school boards work.
That's right. That's right.
Kimba says she's running behind. She's in a work meeting that's running long.
Yeah, we saw her. She sent us a text.
Okay, good.
Hey, Mr. Henderson. Did you go to school today? That's why you have your bomber jacket on.
Yep, I was there. No, Mr. Kim has got I complained once about my office being too cold, and so I walked in today and it was a furnace.
Oh,
I pay for my complaints. Today I just can't get my house warm enough.
yeah.
I got my jungle behind me to pretend like it's the weather or it's the jungle, but it's not.
Yeah, it's sufficiently cold. Hey, Span and Ryan, how you doing? Good.
Go on, Tracy. How are you?
Pretty good.
Good, good.
Are you talking to us, Aaron? You're not on. You're
Yeah,
okay.
sorry. Now I'm muttering to myself. I'm thinking, why? For some reason, my screens aren't working the way I like them to. So, because I want to be able to see everybody and see the agenda. And I don't know. I think something's wrong with my computer. Anyway, here we go. All right, I think I got it. So, hello, good evening. Should we? Let's see. How many people do we have?
We have a quorum. I just counted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You could tell that's where I am tonight, where that was going to be the first challenge is counting. So I appreciate you taking that on for me. Let's go ahead then and get started. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have everybody here. Let's recite our mission so we can remember why we're here. It's important that we're here. Okay, ready? The mission of Paul is to educate our students
to
and to develop in
them
them the capacity
to be responsible citizens,
independent
thinkers,
and leaders. All right, so we're going to do that tonight. We are going to make that happen. So, and with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Wright for some updates.
All right, are we doing minutes first?
Oh, yeah, there's that part. That part, review of the minutes and vote on the approval of the minutes. Is that the next thing here on the agenda? All right, can I have a motion to approve, please?
I move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Jeff. And is there a second? Somebody wave.
I second.
Thank you, Christina. All right, so I'll vote yes. Jackie, how about you?
Yes.
Gina,
Hi, yes.
Jeff?
Yep.
Christina?
Yes, I seconded it though, but yes.
All right, Ryan,
Yes.
Dan,
Yep.
Sterling?
Yes.
All right, that's everybody. All right, great.
And me,
And Jackie.
Oh, and Janisa,
yes.
thank you. Sorry, I didn't, for some reason, the squares weren't all showing up. I thought I had everybody. Did I miss anybody else? So
Pam,
sorry.
Pam just came on.
Oh, good, Pam.
Hello,
You
hello.
voting hello, hello. You voting for the minutes?
Oh, yes.
Good job. That's an excellent, excellent vote. Thank you. All right, now is that everybody? I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Okay. Now, Dr. Wright, I think if that's okay, we can go on then. Minutes are approved.
Yes, all right. We'll dig in briefly to the CEO's report. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the end of February. I thought that there could not be a month that I was more eager to end than this month. It's been a wonderful, great, albeit challenging month, and so we're happy to get to the end of it. Lots of stuff that we had to do for the month of February. One of the biggest pieces was we are in the process of going through the reaccreditation cycle for the next 5 years for AALE. I just want to give a super shout out first to Manya for really quarterbacking the collection of material, so many appendices that it's ridiculous. And then also to the broader team for joining in and helping to revise and update an over 65-page report that was submitted on time for our AALE reaccreditation. So we look forward to hearing from them within the next month to find out if there are any changes and or updates. And then the last piece that we will have to do is a virtual site visit. Typically they would have come to the school, interviewed folks, but because of we're in the quarantine still in the COVID, it's all gonna be virtual. So I'll pause there. Any questions about that? Okay, yeah, it was quite an undertaking and we're really glad to be done with it. So the executive slide deck is there. Not a ton of information, but you'll see a couple of things to note, like our attendance rates are up. We're really happy about that. Even though there's no like formal accountability reports for this year, we feel pretty sure that they'll still do informal, non-tiered PMF reporting. And we want to make sure that, one, first and foremost, that our kids are in school, but that we're also being mindful of all these metrics, for comparative data purposes. And so that information is in your slide deck. And then we had a really robust SPC meeting to talk about A2 interim data a couple of weeks ago, and then a follow-up meeting with EdOps and Jeff, where we have gone through the process of commissioning a second correlation study to draw correlations between our students' interim assessment data and PARC outcomes. But in terms of the A2 interim assessment data, what we learned is really two key points. The first is that our students' performance in this virtual environment on the A2 interim, which is the same interim that we've administered, this is the third year, their performance was significantly higher this year than it was in the previous year and previous years. But when you look at the comparison from A1 from this year to A2, the data was mixed. There's some areas where students did better, but there's some areas where they did not achieve at the same levels. So we have gone through the process of working individually with teachers to unpack that data to really get to the root cause of any slow growth that we've seen. But I really think that the piece that is really important for us to note is that our students continue to perform well in the virtual environment. And so as other school districts are making the decision to try to increase place-based learning, I think that our decision to do that incrementally, really in small incremental steps, so that we don't upset the apple cart of consistency, is the right decision. And I'll pause there for questions or to see if Ms. Spann wants to add anything else as the ED of schools.
Good evening,
Tracy, you mentioned you referred to attendance as being pretty good, and it did look that way. Except the one thing that really jumped out at me was ninth grade, and that I was sort of shocked at how many students have had 10 plus unexcused absences. What I don't know. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll start and then I'll punt to Spann. Let me just say, Dan, unfortunately, ninth grade is has been a really tough grade level relative to attendance. And I think it's particularly hard this year because more than half of our ninth grade students are students who we have never personally encountered.
Right.
And so, where we've had that struggle in previous years, having it with students who don't really know us and we don't really know them because we've not ever had the opportunity to forge those in-person relationships, it's been a struggle. And then also getting them implanted in school, especially because when we look at where our students came from, a lot of them came from, unfortunately, schools and organizations that opted to do a lot of that kind of paper-based work when we transitioned into the virtual environment. So some of those students have been disconnected from school for quite some time. So it has taken quite a bit of work to re-engage them because they've been living in this space of not coming to school every day. And so I'll punt to Spann, who can talk a little bit more about the specific things that we're doing to increase their attendance rates, which have increased pretty significantly, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. As Dr. Wright said, the ninth grade attendance data has been a point of concern and careful monitoring since the beginning of the school year. And we do feel, based upon what Dr. Wright said, them not being in the building and not having that space of live connectivity has impacted this ninth grade cohort more significantly than others. We meet about the ninth grade data every week, and some of the recent strategies that we have in place right now, there's always going to be the grade level incentive strategies for the ninth grades, the little parties, the little social things that they do, which is yielding some move because, as Dr. Wright said, it has incrementally gotten stronger as we've gone throughout the school year. But what we realized before winter break was we need to get more specific with subgroups of students and individualized plans. And so one strategy is one of our assistant deans, Mr. Jones, he works with a group of boys, many of which who are ninth grade, who have demonstrated disengagement for school, whether it's really high attendance absences, whether it's disengagement for class. And so that is one individual strategy, this group meeting that he has with these young men, in which he literally checks to see if they're in class every day and does a follow-up in the moment if they're not in class, whether it be reaching out to them via email or calling the household. Now, that doesn't touch all the ninth graders who are in that concerning number of students with higher absences, but it does connect with a subset of them. Another strategy that we've started recently is having our social workers and our grade level leads craft individual plans and individual check-in meetings with these scholars. This is a work that is still in progress. So we've started the meetings, mainly driven by the social workers right now, but where we're pushing the team to is an actual individualized, incentivized daily and weekly plan. So if you have been missing seventh block every day or these 2 blocks, and that's what's behind your absenteeism, then we're going to track for an entire week if you come, still connected with you that day to incentivize you before it gets to the end of a month or an end of a quarter, which is when the grade level incentives happen. And then just the ongoing calls from our counselors when students are absent. Of course, our attendance counselor, Ms. Long, is still following our truancy protocol. So we have those high-level comprehensive strategies in place. And more recently, we've gotten more towards individualized meetings and individualized plans that are incentivized for our subset of scholars. So that is ongoing work.
Thanks.
All right. Moving on to enrollment updates, and actually there's even fresher data that I can share when we come back around right before the 5th grade meeting. So right now, basically in a nutshell, we're tracking on par for our high school applications, and actually for our 9th grade applications tracking higher at this point in the year than where we were last year. Our true issue is with the middle school, which we are pacing behind where we are this year in comparison to last year. However, we've received data recently from My Schools DC that shows application trends across the city. And currently for high school applications, most high schools are down by about 15%, or they're down 15% across the city. And for K-8 schools, they're down approximately 40%. And so what we're seeing in our application data is not an anomaly. It actually is reflective of what we're seeing across the city, and specifically what we're seeing in Ward 4. And given that Ward 4 is the district that most of our students come from, it is matching what is happening across DC. And there are a number of different reasons for that, right? Like some of it is about just parents having a significant amount of trepidation around, transitioning students from one LEA to the next. There's some trepidation, or there's some, there's some issues around, folks completing applications, whether it's online or at this point doing some of the in-person work. So we continue to push really hard to get those middle school applications up. But I think that this is also, good information as we lead into our broader discussion about the possibility of exploring our expansion to 5th grade, the need to also be able to cast a wider net of students so that we are not feeling super tight around those entry grades of grades 6 and 9 in particular. Okay. If anyone does anyone want to know a little bit more about kind of some of our focused recruitment work? Because I can have Ms. Fan go into that in a bit more detail. Okay. All right. Next one is we've had TNTP data back for a couple of weeks now. We had a packed SPC agenda and didn't have the opportunity to dig into it. I think that the long story short, because we will dig into that data in our next SPC meeting, is that our instructional culture index for the middle school is actually the exact same for the fall as it was last year, and which was like 6.3. And then our high school instructional culture index decreased by 0.9%. It was like 7.2 last year in the fall, and this year it's 6.3. There is, quite a bit of sentiment, I think, around expectations, around expectations in this virtual environment. Our staff has been absolutely phenomenal, and we have pushed incredibly hard. And people feel that, right? Like it's hard when you are dealing with the totality of everything that's happening in the world. But we have been pretty intense relative to expectations, because we're in a space where everyone's talking about student learning loss, and we just don't want that to be our narrative. And so in so much as it has been possible, we have kind of transplanted what we do in in-person learning into a virtual setting, and that feels heavy. Teaching in front of a computer screen for the number of hours that we do, it does feel different than teaching in person. But what our data says is that it's the best choice for students. And so we have looked at that data, as I've shared, and we've made some shifts and adjustments. We've had some focus groups with staff. We'll continue to do that. And in fact, as we are in the process of making plans for what next year is going to look like, we are setting up so that we have focus groups that include every single staff member, and also wide swaths of students and parents, so that all are clear and aware of our direction for next year and what those expectations are going to look like. Okay. Any questions about that, Jeff?
Just kind of going back a few minutes ago, can you just repeat what the plan is for bringing students back into the school building? You talked about doing it incrementally, and I didn't, specifically what does that mean?
So right now we've started small in-person learning groups, and we are focusing really on some of our highest needs and most struggling students. And that launched, I think, last week for the middle school. Attendance was very low. And so the showing is pretty consistent with what we are seeing actually across the city. You know, DCPS kind of went back fully, all schools open, but they opened with adjusted plans to meet the needs of student groups, and the response is mixed. And so when I say bringing students back incrementally, right now, I'm talking about these small groups that we have for high school and middle school students. We also started some high school students. I think Miss Beatty, your baby, was up there getting support in her math class with Mr. Davis. So we have small groups of students who are coming up to get support. When we talk about next year, oh, that is so fun. It's fun because there has not been a ton of relaxing of the current DC Department of Health guidelines around two things. One, the number of students that are allowed within a pod. It still is about 10 students and then 2 additional slots for adults. So that has not changed. And then the second piece that's really the sticker that has not changed is that adults who are assigned to a pod cannot leave that pod and go work with other kids. So there's no cross-pollination of students or adults in pods. And so for a high school and a middle school, that makes what returning for next year look very complicated. And so we had a pretty significant meeting 2 weeks ago. In our executive team meeting today, we spent most of our time pondering some of the options that came out of that last meeting. And then we have another almost 4-hour meeting planned for Thursday to get back into those options, because as much as we would love to say that we'll have this hybrid, what that hybrid looks like is going to be very unique, because those rules have not been relaxed. We'll reach out to find out whether or not it was guidance or actual regulations that we had to abide by. And it is very clear they are regulations, and we will not, we will govern ourselves by those regulations. But that means, we will be limited in terms of the number of seats that we have open at each grade level to serve students in person next year. We have given notice to the staff, come heck or high water, that everyone should plan to be back full time. But again, we have to wait and see what the guidance is from the health department.
Well, you're talking about next year. So this school year.
This school year is the small groups that we have going on.
You're not going beyond. There's no plan to go beyond small groups this year.
There's zero plan to go beyond small groups this year. Yeah.
Whatever guidance there is for the fall, that probably remains to be seen, depending on how things progress, I would imagine.
That's right. That's right, Jeff.
And what about summer? Is there any plans for the summer?
There are. So we actually were working through summer plans today. We are going to have summer programming. Right now, preliminarily, it may be a 2-part act. The first part being using some of the end of school year time and extending that time for the purpose of doing recovery work, and then having a couple of additional weeks in the summer to address learning loss specifically. So we really want to knock out recovery stuff first while we still are fully staffed, and then open up programming for a couple of additional weeks for students who need some work around learning loss work. So a little different from last school year.
And this is a point of clarification from a teacher cross-pollination pod. Is pod being defined as basically a set of students in a single classroom?
That's right. Yeah. So whereas and this is why everything is so crazy and hard for high school. So if we are a group of high school students, however many are on here, let's say there are 10 of us. The 10 of us would be in this class, we would represent a pod. Well, in real life, this group of students would not travel together in a high school, because we all have different needs and different requirements. Some of us are taking AP courses, some are taking PE, others are taking Spanish. So every single class has a different composition of students, right? Well, what the regulations say is that can't happen. That's number one. And then number two, if there is an adult that has serviced another pod of kids, they can't service us unless we take a break for a certain number of days, retest everyone, and then we can switch. So we have started working through some kind of innovative plans where, you know, again, we can target about 20 students per grade level for, you know, in-person instruction in the core content areas each quarter, and then target some other groups of students for CARES type classrooms. That's what DCPS calls them. And that's when the students come in and they do all of their classes virtually, but there's a tech or an aide who's manning the class to kind of offer any type of assistance that they may need.
But just to be clear, these regulations are current regulations when a small percentage of the teachers are vaccinated and there's still community spread. I have to imagine that we should have plans for, and I know you're doing this, your multiple plans. There's a decent chance the regulations are going to change materially for 6 months from now.
I hope so. We talked about that, you know, the thing. So I hope so. I think what we've seen, Dan, is that even when we've had, you know, significantly lower, you know, percentages of community spread, the changes in the regulations have only been incremental. So when community spread was at an all-time low from like an all-time high, the regulations only shifted from being like, okay, well, now instead of 10 kids, you can have 11. So like they've been so slow and incremental. I don't know that there will be material changes because I think they're being incredibly cautious. So I'm not sure. I couldn't bet on that actually.
Right. Can I add one consideration too to what Dan is kind of reflecting upon, which we've thought about too. We hope that the regulations are eased. The tension that we have to manage now is parents are choosing and making selections about schools they want to go to now. April 2nd is when they're going to start applying. And what we know to be true is from some of the increase that have come from parent meetings, just parent calls. Parents are going to need to know from us, of course, before 6 months from now, what the hybrid, they're anxiously waiting to see each LEA and how they're going to manage this hybrid model, even post-vaccination. And so a part of the tension is our urgent need to get some type of model in place, at least at a high level, so we can give parents a sense of what their options will be as we get ready for enrollment season, which has already started in applications in April. That's that tension.
And this is just a point of clarification. Because the vaccine can't necessarily be mandatory, do you have a gauge on staff, like the likelihood of staff on agreeing to the vaccine or their feelings on having it in order to return to work? Do you have a gauge on what that looks like?
Want to talk about that, Will?
Yeah, we have a bit of a gauge. We've heard back from about half of our staff, and about 2/3 of that half are interested in being vaccinated and are working on it currently. We're at this point, all of us are eligible, and so, but also we presume that the other half that did not reply to our survey are also hesitant, right? So we're not assuming that 2/3 of that group are pro-vaccine, and it's right now it's very split. There aren't a lot of people that are wondering and thinking, right? It's like I'm all in or I'm all out, right? And I think that group of people that are all out, even some of the folks that I've spoken to directly, my sense is that as their peers are actually have been vaccinated for some weeks, that will change. But again, that's a month from now or 2 months from now, you know? So we have a bit of information about that. Yeah.
Does that comfort also track with, like, they don't have a choice on whether or not they return to the building if we're in person, but does their likelihood to get the vaccine, does that track with their feelings about returning to the building?
I think so. I think that also we've worked really hard in recent weeks to just make sure that there are safe places to have a dialogue when you know, our general hope is to make some sort of assertion, as Dr. Wright said, about we'll be in the building. And as we kind of push the issue and people get their contracts and we're kind of like obligate them to, you know, commit or one way or the other, that the spaces will be safe for them to ask questions. So it will be like, we'll be able to answer the question. No, you're not required to get the vaccine, but you are required to teach in person. And so you will be interacting with 12 to 40 kids in a given time frame, and so on and so forth. And so currently also, to speak to something that you asked earlier, Jeff, the part of the drive around the small group learning is, of course, like primarily focused on what students are have the highest need, but it's also a learning mechanism so that as students and various students and teachers become comfortable themselves, they're testing out a pod. A teacher can elect to bring their 10 kids in for a short 2-day retreat on such and such a topic and things like that. And so, Kemba, some of those experiences are opening up people's interest. I talked to 2 teachers Monday that were, visibly concerned over the phone or over the Zoom call a couple weeks ago, and then in the building walking through the procedures are like, oh, I understand I couldn't get my head around what you were talking about, right? And so it's a long way of saying we hope that each of these pieces of the puzzle will increase interest in the vaccine and increase interest and willingness to be in the building to whatever percentage that's possible.
It's helpful.
Okay. All right. So with that, I will punt back to Erin.
Thank you. And I'll go straight over to our treasurer's report. Dan or Will?
I'm happy to jump in here. So we don't have a ton of updates here this week, and I think that in some senses this will be the case for the next few months. We're getting into checking into the beginning of budgeting season. The changes that are material here are simply that those FTEs that we ended up not hiring for the hybrid model will continue to provide us some savings as we go along the way. And we had one staff member transition and reworked the scheduling for middle school to be able to support those classes without having to rehire for that role. So that there was some savings there. But in general, our cash position continues to be strong, and we predict it will be such through the year, so that we can continue to sustain strong planning as we go into another strange year. So those are the general updates. In terms of the budgeting process, you guys will hear from the finance committee meeting in the April board meetings. That's 2 months from now. The finance committee meeting, of course, will hear some more details about the next year's budgets and provide an opportunity for some feedback there next month. So that's kind of where we are in the budgeting process.
Any questions from anybody? Yeah, Gina.
So we have really strong debt coverage. Is that due to the PPP loan?
It is predominantly due to the PPP loan, but we would still be well above our loan covenant agreements if we did not have that.
Okay.
Other questions?
Nope.
All right. Thank you, Will. Well, let's go ahead to our committee reports. You've got the minutes for the committee meetings in the board book. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Janisa or Dan or Janisa? Do you have any comments for the rest of us about your committee meetings? Okay, and I don't have anything for the executive committee meeting. So let's keep going.
And I just, Tracy mentioned that we had a extra meeting with EdOps, I think it was last week. And the purpose of it was to want to make sure that the data that we're interpreting from the advisories, from the interim assessments, that we're getting meaningful information from them. And she mentioned that we're doing these additional correlations, and the purpose is to be able to identify what I would call cut scores for each of the different interims, because right now we're using the same cut score for all of them. And it detracts from the interpretation of the results of them. So that's the purpose of the work we're doing with EdOps, is so that, if we want to compare results from one advisory to the next, or from one year to the next, or whatever it may be, that we're able to get better data from them. I think they're a really important assessment right now, especially since we're trying to see if there's learning loss, and we're trying to determine, just within the school year, how things are going. So it's a really good assessment program. We just need to have stronger ways of interpreting the data. So yeah, I was really glad that Tracy set up this meeting, and Janisa attended, a few other folks attended. We had a really good discussion, and looking forward to see what EdOps is able to generate for us.
Yeah, it definitely was a time where you appreciate the variety of expertise on the board. Jeff took us into the deep in terms of understanding regression analysis, R scores, and good stuff like that. And so we were in good company with EdOps and are looking forward to the new correlation information that they provide for us.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jeff, for sharing that, and thanks for pushing to get that set up. All right, anything else before we move on? Okay, so you all may recall, or you may not recall, that on our board work plan this year, we have, roughly speaking, sort of 3 big items aside from our normal board work. And the 3 big items were that we wanted to discuss the expansion of the 5th grade. We want to talk about our strategic plan and figure out what we're doing about our strategic plan, which runs out this year. And we need to figure out what we're doing about our conditions with PCSB. So this is our first one. And we had, when we did our work plan, we put it sort of towards the end of the academic year. And it's, we had kind of done a March, from March onward is when we really expected to be tackling these big items, because we were thinking things would be a little bit clearer at this point. We'd have a better insight into what the world would look like. And I don't know that that's true, but here we are. It's still time, regardless of whether things look any clearer or not. So if you cast your mind back to last April, we started talking about this then. Obviously, we had no idea what we were in for. At that time, we thought, well, this pandemic thing's going to be over pretty soon, and we'll be able to spend our time and attention on something else. Obviously, that didn't turn out to be true. But in any case, whether or not you remember that, the question was raised: should we be talking about expanding to a 5th grade? Our charter allows that. Is this a question we want to explore? We decided at that point to put it off for all the obvious reasons, but here we are again. We're going to revisit it. And Janisa and Dan and I have worked with Dr. Wright and with the executive committee to come up with a plan for how we're going to do this, because we want to be sure that we do it very carefully. So as you see, this is the topic here is the exploration of the 5th grade. How are we going to go about exploring whether we want to do this, when we want to do this, whether it would be a good idea. And so the 2 committees that will be the primarily responsible for the sort of real detailed work in terms of the data and so forth would be the School Performance Committee and the Finance/Facilities Committee, which is a committee that's working together. And so so that's why, Dan and Janisa are taking the lead on sort of this process. So what we're going to do now is Dan's going to kind of set us up for or I guess Janisa, sorry, got it wrong. Janisa is going to go through the schedule, which you received yesterday. And then Dan's going to take us through our task for tonight. So I hope everybody's awake, really thinking, and prepared to engage in a good discussion, because this is important that we get this right and that we're thoughtful and careful about it. So,
Aaron,
am I going to?
yeah, I think Dr. Wright needs to sort of give the overview before we get into the detail, get into
Yeah.
our part.
So that part on the agenda where I have her first, that would be the reason for that? Yeah, good. Thank you.
All right, so Manya's going to
Thank you.
share some slides. Okay, so digging in, and I just want to provide a little bit of context. This is not a data dive. Let me say this again. This is not, I repeat, a data dive. This is really giving some very high level 30,000 foot overview, of information around the rationale for proposing that we launch into a year of study. And I want to make sure that that is clear. We are not talking about voting and agreeing to this right now. We are talking about the possibility of launching into a year of study and research around whether or not we should expand to the 5th grade. Now, just for clarity's sake, expanding to the 5th grade does not necessitate an amendment of our charter. When our charter, when we actually, got our charter for the schools, we were chartered for grades 5 through 8 originally, and then it shifted from 5 through 9. And then when we decided to become a full high school, it went from 5 to 12. So I want to make sure that that's clear. This is not about an amendment to our charter. It's about actually serving all the grades that are currently within the charter. And it's not about agreeing to have a 5th grade. It's about agreeing to start the research year to determine whether we should have a 5th grade. Okay, next slide. And so before we begin, there are a couple of things, because we've been talking about this in different pockets for over a year now. And, we in the SPC, maybe almost 2 years ago, actually started talking about it before we went through the charter renewal process. And we were talking about it because we were noticing the differences in data between schools that served only 6-8 students versus K-8 or 4-8 or 5-8. And once we do our year of study, what we found was that there are differences in terms of the percentage of students who are meeting and exceeding standards when you look at those schools that start serving middle grades at earlier grade levels. So we started this a long time ago, intensified it about a year ago after we went through the charter renewal process. And so before we begin, I just want to level set, because there's been a lot of conversation and dialogue over the last couple of years. I want to level set to make sure that we all have connected and clear hearts and minds relative to where we are right now. Next slide. So the first piece is that I just want to be clear that this is not about meeting PCSB reorganization standards to remove middle school conditions. Like we've talked about that in the past. This is not about reorganizing to accomplish a certain purpose. This is about reorganizing because when we look at the marketplace, when we look at what we believe is a good next step for our organization, at least from the perspective of the executive team, and what we look at what will help us to continue to be viable and even more desirable in the marketplace, that this is a right next step for our organization. So I just want to make sure that everyone knows that separate and apart from the conditions, this is not about conditions right now. This is about looking at our organization, looking at our growth, looking at our desires around student enrollment trends, and believing that the right next step to accomplish some of those goals is to grow downward. Okay, next one. This proposal does not include some of the early thinking about separating our schools from 2 schools into 3. So you may remember about a year or so, actually it's almost 2 years ago, when I was talking about adding the 5th grade, I also talked about reorganizing our schools so that we had an actual middle school of students in grades 5 through 7, an intermediate school of students in grades 8 and 9, and then our high school for students in grades 10 through 12. This is not about that. That proposal is on the back burner, way on the back burner. I still feel some things about it because, we struggle with maintaining our 8th grade students, but this is not about that. So I want to make sure that everyone is clear. This is not about that. This is purely about 5th grade. That other thing is way on the back burner. Okay. All right. The other piece that I just feel like I need to say this, and this is not in reference or relation to anything that I think or I feel the board is feeling, but I want you all to know as the executive leadership of this organization that we will never do anything that we think will destabilize our organization, ever. We worked really hard as a collective, both site-based management and our board, to get to a place of strong stability in just about every area and category that we all can think of. And do not take the process of thinking through a possible expansion lightly. I am too clear about some of the trepidation that exists because of how difficult it was layering our high school onto our middle school infrastructure. You should know that we would not do anything to destabilize this organization. And as much of a good idea that we think fifth grade is, nothing is so good of an idea that we would allow it to, jettison us into this destabilized tailspin. Okay. Next one. And then the last piece is that we do have a position as the executive leadership of the organization, and we're supposed to have a position, but not a personal stake. And I just want to say that because, it's our responsibility as the eyes of this organization to always be looking forward and to bring in front of our board what we believe to be good opportunities and possibilities for consideration. So just know that however the board ultimately lands on this is fine. We will be back next year with another proposal possibly, or possibly not. It depends. But I just want you all to know that this is all about, from our vantage point, looking across our schools, looking across our data. Will did a very deep dive with me the other day. He calls it his Beautiful Mind data. And if you've seen the movie A Beautiful Mind and Russell Crowe's chalkboards, that's what Will's spreadsheets look like. But we've done very deep analysis of our enrollment trends and our data, and believe that if we're going to get to the place where we want to be, which is around that 775 marker, that we do need to seriously consider expanding in different ways. Okay, next slide. So quick high level rationale, Manya, you can click that 2 more times. The first big reason is about why we're proposing this is to align our entry options to more common charter transitional grades. So right now, there are 12 charter schools that break at grade 5, but only 5 of those 12 are charters without direct feeders that have grade 5 as their transition grade. So that significantly limits the number of opportunities and options that we have in the charter space in particular, which for our middle school is the place where now the bulk of our applications are coming from. It limits the number of schools that we have as an option to pull our grade 6 students in. And the second piece is when you take a look at this year-end report from last school year's lottery, okay? So this is from last school year. What you see is our most significant competitor. That means that the other school that most of the families who are applying to us are also applying to for every single grade is Washington Latin. And this is interesting and exciting. This has changed. This did not used to be the case. And so right now, Washington Latin, by and large, is our most significant competitor. And what grade does Washington Latin start at? Grade 5. They also, and they open about 100 seats on grade 5. I was skulking around their website, and that's about the number of seats that they open up. And so if you get in, if you're looking for a school to change and transition, and Washington Latin is top of mind, if you are a parent, you have the opportunity to make that shift when they're in grade 5. When you look across Washington Latin open seats, they actually posted on their website, grade 5 is the grade that they have the most open seats. So they are telling families, if you have any Washington Latin hopes, you need to come in grade 5. And so that takes some of those kids out of our pool. Next bullet.
Sorry, Dr. Wright, could you just explain the first sub-bullet? It says there's only 5 charter schools that have grade 5?
No. So there are 12 charter schools whose transition grade is grade 5. Okay, which means they offer schooling all the way up to grade 5. And then when you get to grade 5, you have to transition. But only 5 of those 12 schools, Dan, are schools that do not have direct feeders. So for example, a school like Mundo Verde, they go all the way to grade 5, but Mundo Verde feeds directly into DCI. So they have a transition path. Of those 12, there are only 5. So like Sella is one of those 5. Roots is like one of those 5 that don't have a direct feeder. And what we know to be true is that children who go to these schools that have direct feeders, they usually go to their direct feeder school because there's an intensive amount of intentionality to make sure, like Yu Ying feeds directly into DCI. I'm pretty good friends with the CEO or the executive director at Yu Ying, Makita, and they feed right into DCI. So those parents are not typically looking for a grade 6 option. They know where they're going at the end of their road.
Are they preferenced in admissions at those schools?
They absolutely are. Yep.
Because they've set themselves up as a formal, so it's not only an informal, it's a formal feeding pattern.
It's a formal feeding. It's a formal recognized feeding pattern. Kimba,
I was just say, because my child's is in that DCI cohort, with the exception of, I think it was after everyone who is already enrolled has a preference for DCI. There are a couple of schools that expanded that would take the available students beyond the capacity that DCI has. And so I think it was last year, those parents would have preference, but they do not have a guaranteed feed. They don't have a guaranteed seat in the way that my child would, because she was in the school enrolled before.
And so, Dr. We're saying that there's basically, leave aside all the DCI, the feeder ones. So you're saying there's 5 schools that are K through 5. And how many, is it order of magnitude, how many are K through 4? Because that's what we're saying we're going after.
There are 8. So there are 8 schools that are K through 4, and there are 11 schools that are K through 3. So as you can see, that opens up the pool, not just to be able to service the 5 for our grade 6 transition, but if we had grade 5, then there are 8 additional charters that transition at grade 4 that would then widen our pool. And I'm going to ask Span to really quickly share. She had a really beautiful analogy around pools, baby pools and Olympic pools to share really quickly.
All right, let me succinctly attempt to share the analogy. The main idea, you all, is that we know for the viability of our organization, we've got to boost up enrollment in 6th and 9th grade. We all agree upon that. We are experiencing right now the impact of a small incoming cohort from several years ago that's now our junior class, that we have to make sure as we phase them out, the subsequent waves coming in are stronger. Formerly, in the past years, probably before the past 3 years or so, we were dealing with an Olympic-sized pool of a net pool of families of which they could possibly consider us as an option. But over the past 3 years or so, because of the shift away from 6 through 8 models and more schools, as Dr. Wright said, moving to 4-8 to K-8, what it automatically does, no matter how compelling our program is, no matter how strong our marketing is, it automatically shifts it from this Olympic-sized pool of net families to almost a kiddie-sized pool. And let me tell you the steps of how it goes from Olympic-sized to kiddie pool. Formerly, when there were more 6 through 8s, and most families were making the decision at the end of grade 5, Olympic-sized pool. Then you enter into the scene, the 5 through 8 schools that Dr. Wright talked about. And so as we're going out right now to recruitment fairs to some of these schools, we don't even have any space for conversation for many of the families about choosing us because they already made their choice at the end of their 4th grade year. So we have this whole subset of families who used to be swimming in an Olympic-sized pool. They're not even in the pool anymore. We're experiencing that right now. And then the third variable is that Dr. Wright talked about, she talked about our competitors. We also have, and we're gathering data on this right now, several new LEAs that are creeping up near us that might not formally be our competitors from the past few years that we're looking at now. But you know, the new school is a sexy school. New building is a sexy building, new name, new whatnot, oftentimes draws. That in and of itself, I can't quantify it, but that's going to take some people away from this Olympic pool. So what we have to be realistic about is that Olympic sized pool net that we were able to pull from years ago will never be the same again unless we start thinking creatively about how we time the entry of our beginning students similar to others in the city, so that we can then capture the attention of these folk who are no longer in this Olympic sized pool.
Right.
Horrible analogy, but the bottom line is the number of parents who are making the choice that we usually depend upon, we can't anymore because a significant amount have already made a choice at the end of the 5th grade year.
Yeah. And just to add one piece to that, I think there are currently at least, I think, 4 charter applications that are being considered by the DC Public Charter School Board. The new charters that have been founded in the past school year, this current school year, no one founds at grade 6. Everyone founds at either grade 4 or grade 5. And so again, to Ms. Span's point, new is alluring. It is where people want to sign up. And our model puts us in a space where we can't compete even with the new because we don't have seats for those kids. Okay.
Dr. Wright, I feel like we're going a little bit deep into the rationale,
Okay.
and we wanted to stay high level. So let's keep going. If you
I
don't-
have two more slides and they're high level. Yep, click the next one and I'll stay out the weeds. So it also allows a longer period of bonding time to reduce 8th grade transition. We are racking our brains, and we have been for 4 years, around 8th grade transition. We have got to shake loose this mindset that Paul is the place to be for a certain number of grades. We have a tier 1 high school that, it would have been tier 1 last year when you put those metrics in. Like, we have a tier 1 high school. And so we also think that maybe a longer period of bonding will help our students to stay through the 8th grade to 9th grade transition. Next one, Manya, next bullet. And then it also allows for the organization to build enrollment numbers in grades where the achievement gaps are less significant. From an academic standpoint, when you get students into middle grades who still are learning to read as opposed to reading to learn, there is a drag on achievement. And so if we can get kids still in that window of when learning to read, it happens in tandem with reading to learn, we think that we could see higher achievement levels over the long haul. Next one. So my last slide, our preliminary research plan. We're going to dig into budgetary and programmatic impact of growth model. And so we've been talking about starting this process with a class of 25 students because we would not need to adjust our staffing structure immediately. Also digging into, the how many years we would want to pass before we move from, let's say, 25 to 50, what our triggers would be to actually expand our staffing model to have a full 5th grade team. We do not perceive that as being something we would do in the first 2 years. And so really digging deeply into that. Also doing a deep dive into the marketplace, looking at how many seats are open for grade 5 students across the city and assessing supply versus demand. Of course, a deep dive analysis of risks versus reward. So we need to really dig into each of these different factors and figure out what would be the significant risks, and do those risks, are they significant enough for us to abandon ship on this idea? We need to dig into curriculum and assessment options, of course, because we would not want to bring on grade levels of students without those things being in place. And then assessing our physical plan and schedule to develop a facilities plan for younger students. Of course, we're already in this space where we keep our middle school students highly separated from our high school students. I don't think that would be a big stretch, but you do have to consider what life is like for serving 10-year-olds as opposed to serving 11-year-olds. There are significant developmental differences between those two groups of kids. And so those are things that we would need to consider, to include things like 5th graders still need recess. Our middle schoolers don't have recess the same way, but 5th graders need recess. So those are some of the things that we would need to think about. Not an exhaustive list, but that's a high level preliminary list of what we would research. Okay. All right, I put back to you, Erin.
Thank you. Thanks very much. All right, so then Janisa, and this is now we are moving back to the document that I sent yesterday. So Janisa, if you would go over what we have planned as the way in which we will, as a board, undertake this, please.
Yeah, so as Tracy mentioned, the first step, if we choose to go forward, would be to plan. So we have to first decide, do we want Tracy and the rest of the team to commit the time and resources to finding out the answers to the questions she laid out in the high level overview, as well as additional points that we think will need to be in place. And we'll do that in April. And then after that, we'll have the school will have through the summer to work through their plan, and then we'll vote again on whether or not they should proceed with setting up this kind of small class of 25 as a test. And then again, we would vote in October to actually move forward with opening enrollment. And so what we need to do now ahead of the first vote, which is about whether or not Dr. Wright and her team should proceed with developing the plan and doing the research for it, is decide what the framework and criteria that we would really be looking at is, and use that both for the finance committee and the school performance committee. As Erin mentioned, we'll kind of do deep dives with that and Dr. Wright, and then take that back to the whole board to vote on. Any questions about the schedule or layout for it? And then I think next Dan was going to talk about, like, kind of walk us through a framework to look at the rationale and criteria.
And all of this is for discussion. So as we're going through this, for you to think about, you know, what Janice has just talked about is a proposal. And that timeline is a way we could do this. It's not the only way. And obviously what we want is for this timeline and this decision-making process to reflect what the board wants. So Dan, over to you, please.
So the point, and so the second page of what Erin sent around is really just first brainstorming of potential things. And so what we're trying to do here is to give Dr. Wright and the rest of the team sort of guidance on what is the basis for the board to vote on the proposal. So we don't want to show up in April and say, oh, but this is really important to us, Dr. Wright. You didn't give us any data on this or explain this, so we can't vote. So it's really, tonight what we want to do is say, these are the things that are important to us to understand that you've got a plan and you can show us in April or June, whenever specific things are appropriate. For us to approve it, what do we need to know? The goal, ideally, we would have a smaller list than what I put down on the page. I intentionally added some things that maybe aren't as high priority to some people, but because we really want to have Dr. Wright and team target what's most important for us to make our decision. And each individual is can make their own decision for voting. So we don't have to collectively decide this is our number one criteria, this is our number two, this is our number three, because collectively it's really do we approve or not. But what we really want to do is discuss what are the things that the leadership team should be focused on, putting together slides and getting the data for us to be comfortable with the decision.
So Dan, how do you want us to go through this? Do you want people to just sort of go through the list as a whole, or do you want to take it kind of section by section? What's the best way for us to discuss this?
Maybe we can go down section by section. I think we now have heard Tracy's has outlined sort of the proposal. So we understand it's starting with a small 5th grade class as part of the existing middle school. And we've got the high level framework or rationale, which is really about opening, better aligning with the market, more recruitment opportunities, more time with the students to deliver better pedagogical outcomes as the main. So I don't think it's too controversial to say that confirming the validity of that rationale, that it will help our ability to attract more students and help how we perform, that's sort of table stakes. And so Dr. Wright presented some of the data around our competitor students today, but I think getting more granular about listing out the number of schools and the number of students going to those schools and just really understanding the marketplace more in terms of who do we consider our competition, where are students going in at 5th grade versus 6th grade, things like that. Shouldn't be controversial that we need a bit more on the validity of that specific rationale. I think what's really would be helpful to get feedback from people is, even if you get comfortable that yes, it ticks the rationale, what are the other things we need to be comfortable with, such as Tracy alluded to one of them. How do we get comfortable that having 10-year-olds in the building is a good risk reward? It makes sense to do. Is that important to the board to know? And if it is, then one thing that we would want the team to do is come back to us with more granularity on how they separate the middle schoolers, how they particularly think about 10-year-olds. And they're not going to have a detailed plan. I want to be clear. And Sterling made a good point at the finance committee meeting, which is we're not getting into the weeds of how they're going to operationalize and manage all of this. What we as a board need to be comfortable with is they've outlined a plan and we know who's going to execute it, but we're not going to debate, oh, well, you really need to you need to have recess at 10 a.m., not 11 a.m., or minutia, or even more than minutia. But we do need to remember we're still the board and not kind of micromanage, but we need to be comfortable that there is a plan and it's not just one bullet point. So I'll stop there, and hopefully everybody has been able to pull up the document, and maybe we can talk about impact on student experience. What are the factors that you want more information on?
Dan, I would also say, just to back up a little bit, to make sure that, we need, I think, a better articulation of the problem. Because it seems to me that the issue here is sustainability, that we need to maintain the enrollment for the school to exist. And right now there seems to be some problem with that. And I'd like to see that better articulated, in terms of, what we're facing here. I get the gist of it, but I think it would be important to flesh that out a little bit further. Because I think if there wasn't an enrollment problem, would we be adding a 5th grade? You might, it's kind of ask the question that way, are there other reasons to add a 5th grade other than sustainability and maintaining enrollment that will support the school?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that is like the first bullet point on the page, and it's good that you brought us back to that, because I think that is important.
So Gina, I don't know if you just want us to jump in.
Yes,
so
please.
My thoughts are just like, if you're a parent of a 4th grader and you're trying to, you're evaluating options and there's a high school attached, it gets to the safety and security issue. Just how do we have the space to segregate these students in a way that parents will feel comfortable? And how big would the 5th grade class ideally get? I know we talked about starting at 25, but we have talked about how much capacity the building has, and kind of where our current understanding where the capacity is different from, I think, where people were 10 years ago. So how many 5th graders could we actually accommodate under our best, if we had a robust 5th grade class, what does that look like? And the third piece is the curriculum. And just, it's not just watered down sixth grade, right? Just like high school's not adding, adding rigor to the eighth grade work. So how challenging is it to build a fifth grade curriculum? I don't, maybe it's very easy, I don't know, but.
I would say one of the questions that I would have is how are we telling the story and threading the needle between fifth grade and 12th grade? Because if the purpose is retention, I think that not only in the marketing, but in the curriculum, we need to think about if I'm a fourth grade parent and I'm sending my kid to Paul that has a fifth through 12th grade, what is going to be the benefit of having them stay that entire time? Like, is there something that we're intentionally building on each year so that the kids at the 12th grade year are outpacing our closest competitor because we've had them that long? So I would just say thinking about the threads between the fifth and the 12th grades.
Well, ironically, we don't tell that story now, from 6 to 12. So if that is, if we get audience research that suggests to us that families are looking for a 5th to 12th grade journey, then I would say, let's make that a part of our marketing plan. Let's make that a part of the journey we take people through on the website. But I don't know that if that's what is the draw to bring kids to a school for the 5th grade or not. But that's not something that we currently do right now.
That's a really good point, Pam, because you're right, we don't do that. And as a parent of 3 children who I made choices because they could go from for their private school from elementary all the way through grade 12, it was like an honor to be a lifer. That's like weird, but that's what you were called. If you started in elementary school and you went all the way through 12th grade, then you were a lifer. And that was actually part of their private school story. And so I had never thought of the fact that that is not a very prominent pitch in our marketing about why you want to be, we could call it a Paul, blah, 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 whatever. Coming here in grade 6 or grade 5 and then making it all the way through and really playing up the advantages of that. So thank you for raising that.
I would go back to Gina's point about what does the having 5th graders in the building with 12th graders, just in terms of the liability piece of it. I know that at the middle school, the KIPP middle school that I taught about, when we expanded to high school, and for the first year of the high school, the 9th graders were in the basement of the middle school until then they had 2 grades and they were able to move into their own building. And there was a ton of liability issues around the movement of the 9th graders, just because the 5th graders are really young and little. And so I just don't know from a liability perspective if there's insurance or things that have to happen.
So
And
clearly,
we're not looking for, every question doesn't have to be asked today. There's still space after today if people want to email, just, for folks who still need to kind of think about it a bit.
so
Right.
absolutely. And so there's obviously a clear theme here that the board's very concerned just about the having 10-year-olds and 18-year-olds in the same building. And just so it's clear that between from Will and the facility standpoint and just overall, whether it's liability, whether there's clearly a bunch that will want to hear on that. So I think that's helpful. Other things around impact on student experience. We've talked about the curriculum.
I would want a trend analysis at similarly situated schools, that if there is data that looks at student success metrics, that would be different from when the school looked at before 5th grade as opposed to once they had. I know some of that stuff is going to be dated because when schools expanded, it's been a while. But if there are metrics that look at how it impacted expanding to the 5th grade, how it impacted long-term student achievement, I would want to know that.
Yeah, similar to that, I think, Tracy, I actually mentioned this a while ago, but I know if you look at the PMF ratings for like a K through 8 school versus a 6 through 8 school, you might argue that they're doing better. And what I'd like to see is what the 6 through 8 achievement looks like in a K through 8 school. So in other words, some of the K through 8 schools looking better because they have those younger kids and they're at, it may be the higher performance in the lower grades is washing out the poorer performance in the middle school grades. So
we already know that to be true, right? Like we know that the younger grades perform at a higher rate.
right.
And yeah.
Yeah. So I just, if we can compare apples to apples, in terms of comparing performance of K-8 and 6-8, if we just look at 6 through 8 in each organizational configuration, just to know that, just to see whether, in fact, maybe the 6 through 8 students are doing a little bit better in the K through 8 schools. I don't know. But I think that was one of the arguments. It would be good to have the students longer and they'll do better in the middle school grades. And you might conclude that by looking at some of the 4 through 8 schools or K through 8 schools or whatever. So that might be, if that's possible, I think that would be important to do. Just in terms of trying to convince ourselves there might be some advantage in terms of student performance with adding a 5th
And
grade.
I have one that sort of what Jeff is saying has prompted me to think about what it means in terms of professional development. And I'm thinking what this could be another advantage, as you're mentioning, Jeff, what it does for teachers of high school students to be on the same faculty or in the same, even I imagine you'd keep the faculty separate as you do now with the middle school and high school, but there are times when they come together. And I know that, well, in the IB world, the introduction of a primary years program into a school that has a diploma program significantly changes the way that the high school teachers start thinking about teaching, because their elementary teaching is just very different, and you have to be so much more intentional about, like what you were talking about, teaching kids to read for learning is different from having kids reading for learning is different from learning to read. And high school students in a building like ours need teachers who know how to teach reading, not just teachers who use reading to learn. And so it would be interesting I wonder whether there's any advantage to us in having that cross-pollination and whether there's any data about that. I don't know that there would be. I don't know whether there's anybody has tracked it, but I'm just thinking we need a balance. I want a balanced view. I want to know what are the dangers of doing this, but are there also benefits? Like, what are we going to get from it? How are we going to gain? Because it's got to be worth it. It's going to be a lot of effort. It's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of money. What do we get from it? For our kids that are there now, I guess that's what I was thinking. How is it going to benefit a high school student, in the long run?
So that brings the question to my mind as to, when you think of 5th grade, is it going to be a self-contained classroom, or are the students going to be going from, different, they're going to have more of a middle school experience rather than a self-contained classroom? Because I think that would be a big change. And, I don't know, I think most schools with the 5th grade probably have self-contained classrooms right now, maybe bringing in a math teacher or something. No, they're treated more like middle schools in the 5th grade. Okay. There are no self-contained 5th grades anymore?
Not in the spaces that we're talking about. So kids learn how to transition pretty early on. But when you talk about your traditional, like DC public schools, yeah, they're still probably highly self-contained, but not so much. when I was a principal for DC Public Schools, I started trying to stop moving from that self-contained space because it just made no sense that one person would be an expert across 4 subject areas. You're a mathematician, but not a historian. Like it was, so yeah.
Even DCPS, right, they had started, even before I left, on the elementary level, even as low as 3rd grade, departmentalizing. And students getting used to moving to different content teachers.
Fifth grader in the model you're contemplating would have as many as 4 or 5 different teachers.
Say that again, Jeff. 5th grade would have as many.
Fifth grade that you're contemplating, students would have 4 or 5 different teachers.
Yeah, probably 6 or 7. You know, it just depends. They would transition. The thing is like right now in our middle school, like when our 6th graders come, that's a core part of like that Paul Prep programming, where we teach them how to move from one class to the next. And we organize in such a way where the kids are not moving from the 1st floor to the 3rd floor. They're typically just moving from this class to that class, to that class, to that class, to that class. They're on their rectangle in their wing. So there's not a lot of movement outside of that. And then actually in the last year, we actually implemented escorted movement in our building. So the kids line up and they're walked from point A to point B. But it's still something that we can look into and report back on.
From the marketing point of view, would parents, how do parents receive that kind of a model versus a self-contained model? I'm not.
Yep.
And I don't want to rush us, but on the other hand, I'm just conscious of the time.
Yep. So the next section is, to me, a real question mark, and I'd be curious of Dr. Wright's view, which is how much do we need to be surveying different constituencies, existing parents, prospect parents, faculty, staff, PCSB. There's a lot of constituents. Should that play into whether or not we make this decision or not? So that's an open question.
Yeah, I don't know that current parents would be as much of a necessary survey as really looking at the marketplace. I think that's what's most important, is what's happening in the market. I remember years ago at my last charter LEA, we were considering some expansion and growth opportunities and looking at the number of what they considered high quality seats at different grade levels. I think we have to look at that. And then I think, again, we have to look at what the need is, like what is the highest growing population of students in Washington, DC. We all remember, well, I remember at least like maybe 7 years ago, it was pre-KK. Those children are getting ripe now for 5th and 6th grade. So there was an explosion, about 5 or 6 years ago for the pre-KK seats because of gentrification. You had a lot of newer, younger families moving in, young children, and we were running out of seats at pre-KK. So those babies have grown up. And if their parents have maintained their property and they still are residents of DC, then they are going to be looking for those schools. And so I think, Dan and board, that really it's less about the internal surveys and our current constituent surveys and more about what does the market need and what are our chief competitors doing.
All right, so that's what Tracy thinks.
Yeah,
I
I'll
would
just
agree with that, but what do the other board members think?
Yeah, I'm going to add to what Tracy's saying. From a marketing perspective, from a needs assessment perspective, this decision in part could be driven by our existing internal audience, but it's really about the competitive landscape and where we may be losing a foothold or trying to gain one, and also assessing the needs of the parents that we don't have. What are they looking for? We've got the folks inside. If there's a different survey that we need to do, it's just how do we keep the folks inside? But I'm not sure that there's an indicator that suggests bringing on a different grade or adding another grade is going to cause us to lose existing families I'm not sure what the impact to them would be directly.
This is Sterling. I'd like to piggyback on Dr. Wright's last point and partly on Jeff's in terms of which is the horse and which is the cart. You probably heard me mention that before, but instead of chasing what the competition's doing, chasing the students, what the common marketplace is, that shouldn't be our driver. Our driver should be academic performance, and that should outweigh every other decision that we're doing. And I think that as we put together our rubric, we need to make sure that the decision on adding on the 5th grade has a beneficial uplift to academic performance each subsequent year up until graduation.
Yeah, I think to echo Sterling, and I guess going back to maybe would have been further up in the sheet, but understanding the impact on middle school leadership to their capabilities of having another grade to manage and how that will impact just sort of the academic experience for the whole middle school. So it sounds like somebody please pipe in if they think it's important to going back to the parental support, to be talking to the existing parents. And then similarly, in terms of faculty and staff, I'm not sure, my sentiment would be maybe similar to existing parents, but again, I'll let people pipe in if they think it's important that we get buy-in to add an extra grade. It doesn't seem, I think it would be different if we were talking about a school reorg where we were doing the 3 different schools that Dr. Wright said is clearly on the back burner, is not on the cards here, but adding a 5th grade, do we think that we need to be surveying faculty or staff?
So I think that, sorry, I'm stepping a little bit back in terms of surveying existing parents. I think we need to see what existing parents have small children and maybe just targeting those existing parents to see if adding a 5th grade will make them want to add their other child to a part of the Paul family in the 5th grade. So I don't think we should completely ignore the existings, but I think we should find out who has younger kids. I don't have a real opinion as to the staff.
I think
Now, I would just ask the board, you know, if we embark upon surveying, that there's just clarity around, so what does that mean, right? Like, so what is, we go and we take the time to collect this data, like, what does that mean? Is that your deterrent? Like, what are your driving, also, what are your driving factors for, this is what is going to help us make this decision?
I think getting some input from some of the middle school staff would be, you know, what would they see as some of the challenges, some of the benefits? You know, I'd like to hear from them. That would be, I think it'd just be, get their input. You know, if it's a survey or if it's just a focus group, however you want to do it.
I don't want to be contrarian here, but just as another view, I don't know that the parent or the faculty staff, I don't think any of those views of the community, I mean, we haven't gotten to PCSB support yet, but those are actually, none of them are important to me. And just, you know, to go to the bigger question, I mean, the ones that we've talked about, you know, what's the advantage for the kids? Like, how is it going to actually, what Sterling was talking about, how is it going to improve the overall experience so that our kids are getting a better education? And then the one we haven't gotten to yet, which is, you know, that we have to be able to do this, the thing that Dr. Wright talked about earlier about not destabilizing things in any way, but particularly financially, because that's where that, when we undercut that previously, that just meant we couldn't do the programming we wanted to, and it just led to instability. And then the teachers were unhappy because, you know, so it just had a cascading effect. So for me, I feel like because there's limited time, and resource, you know, yes, we're essentially saying to Dr. Wright, use the resource that you need to. If we vote in April and we say, conduct this exploration, what we as a board at the governance level are essentially saying is, spend the resource. We agree that you can spend the resource on this exploration, but I don't want to have them spend, even if the resource is staff time and not like actual money, or even more so if it's staff time. I don't want them to be spending time on something that's not really significant to us in making the decision. So just for me, I would not, I mean, I feel like those are, none of those under views of community would be important in my vote. They wouldn't make me vote one way or another. They're sort of interesting, but not important for me in my decision, just for me.
So Aaron, what I would say is, I think where Christina was going in terms of surveying faculty, or I mean, sorry, parents who have younger children, to me, that goes to understanding the market, and it's surveying prospective parents. So I don't think it's going to be dispositive. Like, I think the point is we need to get feedback from people who have, we need to understand what parents with younger children are thinking. And I think Christina was giving a good way to, we know these parents, and if we know they have younger kids, that's an easy surveyor. But like, if you don't get them and you get other parents, and you get a good, if we understand either through data or surveys or just how people are actually acting with their feet, I think that gives you that, and that really goes to the market, not to whether our existing parents are supportive. On faculty, I think what Jeff's suggestion is helpful in the sense that probably 6th or 7th grade teachers will be a pretty good at flagging potential issues. I don't think we necessarily should be asking them permission.
Right.
So I don't think we should be doing a survey, do you want it or not? And if they say no, we take that into our vote. But I do agree that doing a focus group with 6th and 7th grade teachers and saying, what do you see as the positives? What do you see as potential negatives? What should we be preparing for as good diligence, but not going to be dispositive unless they say they raise an issue that's a big red flag that maybe the network staff hadn't thought about. That's how I sort of view those.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and I think that's good, a synopsis, and I appreciate that. I was just sort of trying to move things along in the sense of saying, in terms of giving some guidance about where to put most of the effort, but yeah, thank you. Sorry, go ahead. Somebody else was about to speak. Yeah, Janisa.
Yeah, I was just also going to add about the 6th and 7th grade faculty. If what I heard is correct, that for the first year, we're not adding staff, we're not adding to complete this trial run, it's likely going to be 6th grade teachers that are now teaching 5th grade students. And so I would be curious, less from like the survey of, yeah, do you want it? Yes, no. Do you support it? But do you have the expertise type of thing? Do you have the ability to build the curriculum and teach just the pedagogy? Because I taught 6th and 7th and 8th grade, but I would not teach 5th graders. And so I do think it matters who we're saying on staff is able and capable to teach 5th graders.
Okay. So that was good discussion on PCSB. I don't know if we need to debate that. I think that's I think we need to get more information in terms of just in general, what are actual requirements. And then at a later point, when we have more, we need to figure out if there's no requirements still, they're probably not watching every school's board meeting, so they may not be aware. When do we want to give them a heads up and talk to them? So we can talk about that now, but I don't think any of us are that informed other than perhaps Dr. Wright about that. So I think we just need to get more informed about what the process is. And then if there's not requirements, what might be informal ways to go about that. Does that make sense?
When I think about this, just try to answer a few simple questions. What's the problem? What's the proposed solution? And if the solution, let's say, is adding 5th grade, what needs to be done to make this successful if it's going to improve student performance? across the school? If we can answer those questions, I think, and there'll be lots of other things underneath of that. But if we could put together a story here and try to gather the data that answers, these high level questions that I don't know if they're exactly the right questions. I think the first two are, what's the problem? And I go back to, we have to understand what the problem is. What's the proposed solution? And there are different aspects to that. And then what are the issues? If this is the solution, how do we successfully implement it?
I would add to that. It is, of course, student achievements always our outcome and always the desired goal. But I think adding a fifth grade has the potential, it has to be sussed out to put our enrollment patterns on a more regular, have a more regular ebb and flow perhaps to our enrollment patterns. And that puts the school on more solid financial footing, which means we can make better academic plans, right, and programming.
Yep.
So to me, it has to strengthen all of those. I think this has a potential to do that if done correctly. It checks a couple of boxes there, which ultimately makes us a stronger school community.
Yeah, and what you just articulated is, what's the theory of action here? If we've identified the problem, what's the theory of action for solving it? And you just outlined, if we do this, then that'll happen, and this will happen, and blah, blah, blah. And ultimately the kids will graduate as higher performers. So that, just spelling that out so that we all are on the same page about, the problem, the theory of action to address it, and then go on to address some of the issues that we have.
I think part of this process is also, it's very easy to say, I'm confident Dr. Wright can very much articulate what the problem is and what the outcome we want is. My guess is we did that for the high school too. But what we also need to do is say, okay, well, what are the areas of potential risk and how big are the risks and what are we doing to mitigate them? And think about things that, because rarely do things go exactly according to plan. And so I think part of the whole purpose of this is making sure that we're raising things that perhaps the school leaders haven't focused on, or perhaps they weren't going to dedicate a lot of time to studying, that we as a board want to get comfortable with, that if things don't go according to plan, what are the bad out, like if something bad happens, is it just that, well, we only get a 20-person class or a 15-person class, or is it that our whole middle school academic performance collapses because X, Y, and Z? I don't think that's going to be a case, but I think what we're trying to get out here is, what are the areas you need to get comfortable with so you can say that the risks are definitely not so bad that we don't want to look towards the benefits. So we're definitely pushing past the time that we had allocated. So I think there's no question, financial impact, Erin already mentioned that, that's on the list. We just need to understand, we're in a fortunate position right now of having cash reserves. So, but understanding what would be the upfront investment, and would it, at 25 students, would this be a self-sustaining expansion, or would it need to get to 50 students to, et cetera? So what are any other issues that you want the leadership team to be coming up with a response to, or an issue that you're concerned about? And as Tracy said, this isn't your only chance. So if things come to you later after this meeting, please send them to Dr. Wright and Erin.
I would want a general idea of what this might do to like the capital planning for like the building once it's at capacity. And or like imagine what capacity was and what that implication would be on the building space. And then from projections for what we would need to maintain it at completed as it's moved out, what we would need to be able to maintain the staffing, like what kind of staff would we need to be able to maintain to support that school once we've grown to capacity of 1 fifth grade section or 8 fifth grade sections, which I know is many a bridge too far.
All right, well, let's stop it there. And thank you, Dan and Janisa both, but thank you very much for taking us through that. It's the beginning of an important discussion, and we will in March as just, whoops.
You're on mute. You're on mute. Come on. You're still on mute.
There we go. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. I will keep my hands off the mouse. So what I was saying is, Janice has gone through the timeline with us. In March, we'll spend some time in the all of our committee meetings, going into some more detail. At the board meeting in March, we'll go into a deeper look into what we're talking about with some of the answers that we have here. And in April, then we'd like to be in a position to make the decision as to whether we want to continue the exploration. And the reason we're setting it up like that is so that because things are so uncertain right now, we feel like we need to have these milestones. So in April, we say we're going to go ahead and explore or not. If we're going to go ahead and explore, then in June, we take another step, and in October, we take yet a further step. So we're taking this step by step with an opportunity to stop and make decisions very intentionally, so we don't kind of get on a roll and we find that, you know, all of a sudden here we are at EdFest next December with something that we're thinking, how did we get here? We're not really ready for this. So that's the plan. So I'm gonna stop the discussion now of that. Thank you again very much, everybody, for engaging in that. We have one quick AOB, an announcement from Christina, or an update rather from Christina on our search for a new trustee, an additional trustee, and then I think we can adjourn unless anybody else has anything. But Christina?
All right, so I have been interviewing candidates for our board position. I've had 5 interviews thus far. I have 1 more left from Janisa, so I will sneak her in. But we have 3 really strong, promising candidates. And like I said, I have 1 more left to do, and they hit all the boxes that we've asked for. Not one of them does not hit all the boxes, but multiples do hit the boxes. So we need to talk about at our next board meeting whether we want to pick 1 person or 2. That'll be something we'll talk about at our next board meeting, and we should be able to vote at our next board meeting on the new board members.
Okay, I think it's 1. We have to go 1 or 3, right? It has to be is that right? No, we're at 12 right now. So we have to go to
Yeah,
13.
but
well, anyway.
I think we have a potential person coming off.
Okay.
So that's why we may do 2.
All right, so we'll talk about that at the executive meeting, so that we'll have a plan for when we hopefully have a plan for March. Yeah? Okay, wonderful. Anything else from anybody? Well, thank you all so much.
Real quick, Erin, I just
yeah.
want to thank Dan and Janisa for putting together that framework that really helped me think through a lot of things. And I'll be ready to vote for the 5th grade next month. We're all set. I'm sure it'll just take a few weeks. Tracy.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.